Hi there. Welcome to Pallet University and the final episode of our PaleoPoke series where we take a look at the fossil Pokemon from the perspective of a real paleontologist. So as we'll get into in the actual content of the video, I have some guests with me. We had a Zoom call in about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour long conversation with some people who do like science communication for a living, and they'll, talk all about what they do. But I want to talk about what's going to become very apparent once we get into the actual meat of this episode, which is the video quality. So I made the mistake of recording through Zoom rather than just being on a Zoom call and recording my screen with OBS. That is my bad. So the audio and video quality are not excellent, but the quality of the content itself and with the folks that I'm talking with in this video is really awesome. So this is very much a really good just talking head video to have on in the background. So yeah, once you look past that, the video is, I'm actually super happy with how this interview turned out. So hopefully you are as well. So with that, let's just get into the video. Hi there. Welcome to Pallet University and sort of the conclusion of our PaleoPoke series where we take a look at the fossil Pokemon from a real paleontologist perspective. And I'm really excited about this video because, as you can see, we have some guests. So Will and David, go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hello. I'm David Moscato.
I'm Will Harris.
We are paleontologists. We are both here in East Tennessee, associated with the Gray Fossil Site and Museum, which is a very cool, small museum, part of East Tennessee State University, that has a fossil site right in the backyard, which is the place where we were both academically trained in grad school.
Yep.
And we are hosts of the Common Descent podcast, which is a podcast about paleontology, evolution, life history, and we're also huge nerds. So on our podcast, we talk a lot about movies and we talk a lot about nerdy stuff, and we have talked a fair number of times about Pokemon.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're here to just sort of have a discussion about some, Pokemon science things, mostly biology, a little bit of geology, just because I felt like I personally had to. It's going to be sort of a discussion type thing. So this is very much a talking heads type video. So if you want to just throw it on in the background, that's totally fine. Make sure to check out the Common Descent podcast wherever you find podcasts. The link to that will also be down below in the description. So first thing that I wanted to ask you guys about was I actually just noticed this in the most recent episode, is that Crickettoon's cry is in the theme of your podcast.
Yep.
Yes.
I just noticed that for the first time. So I don't know if that was like a recent thing or if it's always been there, but I just caught that. So I thought that was just a fun little tidbit to throw in.
The opening and ending theme to our podcast is a free-to-use song we found on OC Remix, which is called On the Origin of Species, and it's a remix of the evolution theme from Pokemon.
I've never caught that. Wow.
So if you pay attention past the voice, the talking in the intro, it is actually the evolution theme, and it's got a couple little sound effects worked in.
Huh.
Yep.
I'll definitely have to pay a little closer attention to that next time then. So one of the things that I always talk about in some of my videos is the accuracy of the Pokedex.
Yes.
Ooh.
And because in like the in-game world, it is sort of portrayed as you are a field worker for whatever scientist of that region. So ideally, these are like your field notes, which, for any non-scientist watching, we take very seriously. Like they can be legal documents if need be. So I was wondering about your thoughts about some of the more suspect entries in the Pokedex.
That's like one of your white whales.
I have spent a lot of time and a lot of pages and Word documents thinking about this exact question. Is the Pokedex an accurate source of information? Which is important.
Can it be trusted?
Can it be trusted?
Yeah.
Which is important when you're dealing with nerdy conversations about this kind of stuff of, how do we interpret the biology of these things? Or if you're like us and you're like, what if there were Pokemon in Star Wars? What could they do? You want to have an idea of what Pokemon are actually capable of.
Like a baseline to work off of.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the Pokedex is the obvious source of information. But if you start delving into it, you find a few trends that you shouldn't see in scientific notes. For example, there are things in the Pokedex that contradict what you see in the games. You know, there'll be Pokedex entry says it can fly, but the Pokemon can't learn fly or something like that. Sometimes the Pokedex will contradict something you see, like a Buneary has a Pokedex entry that says its ears are always rolled up, but in a bunch of the sprites for Buneary, its ears are extended. And sometimes it contradicts itself. Sometimes it contradicts the reality of physics. There are things that are just... Machamp has an entry that says it can move mountains. And while that is a idiomatic expression, physically you can't really push a mountain. So there's a bunch of stuff in the Pokedex that's like, this is a little bit exaggerated or a little bit not actually accurate. But then on the other hand, most of the stuff in the Pokedex is perfectly benign, and this Pokemon eats berries, and okay, that's pretty straightforward. So my basic angle of that is everything in the Pokedex is fine. Take it with a grain of salt. Some things are just straight up clearly a bit exaggerated or a bit not quite accurate. You kind of have to play it by ear sometimes.
It makes me think of if you were to read through either an old textbook, but even better is like, an old, field guide or something, or collection of research. Like I had an old book about alligators and crocodiles. Okay. And to me, the Pokedex reminds me of one of those, or like a kid's animal fact book, where it's like, most of what's in there is fine. Like most of that alligator crocodile book was fine, but then there was one that was like, you can identify male and females by the color of their eye shine, which is nonsense. Yeah. That's like, I'd never heard that before. It's so out of date.
Right.
And so I feel like
some things just aren't quite up to date, or aren't quite thoroughly researched.
Or simplified in like the kids stuff where they're like, this fact. It's like, all right, you're 80% right.
Right.
You're not wrong, but you're...
and sometimes it's exaggerated, where it's like, if you... I'm trying to think of an example. Like, I think Houndoom has a thing where it says, if you're burned by its fire, the pain will never go away.
Yep.
Which is that I know what you're trying to say, but read literally, it doesn't really.
Exactly. And so I actually came across another one like that. So I was making a video about Tortuga and Caracosta, and I'm trying to remember which one it was. I want to say it was the Ultra Moon Pokedex entry, but it was basically, it said that the shells that it eats for Caracosta make its own shell harder. And I'm like, I understand that, like, you need to explain that, like, the calcium in the shells that it eats, likely is like incorporated into its skeleton.
Yeah.
That's, bones are made out of calcium. But like, the way it sounded was almost, I kind of read it. I mean, maybe I was reading too much into it. I do that with a lot of things, but
that's why we're here.
Yeah. But so I kind of read it as like it directly, like almost like a mollusk creates a shell, like how it secretes it. Yeah. As if it wasn't part of its skeleton already.
Yeah, that it's like incorporating the material directly from stomach to shell.
Right. And I'm like, that's just not how anything works.
Yeah. And I think that for me is the other sort of final note on Pokedex accuracy is, as much fun as it is to treat the Pokemon world as a self-contained universe with its own logic, you do have to step back every now and then and recognize that these are entries written by game designers.
Yes.
And so sometimes there's stuff in there that's just scientifically off.
Yeah.
Way back in Red and Blue, Aerodactyl has a Pokedex entry that calls it a dinosaur.
Yep.
And okay, a game designer put that in. It never happened again, which tells me that someone's kid yelled at them and then they learned and they never put it back in there. But yeah, sometimes there's explanations in there, and no, that's not scientific, but this wasn't written by someone with an in-depth knowledge, so you can kind of see where it came from.
Yeah, it sounded good.
Right.
Which is what was important.
I've definitely found that the most sort of outlandish ones are from the early years as well, such as like Ponyta's hooves being harder than diamonds. I don't remember which specific game that was in, but I'm pretty sure that was Gen 1.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's just not at all possible. But yeah, I was just wondering some thoughts on that. And I know in your episode where you talk about Pokemon paleontology, you talk a lot about living fossils as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage everyone to go check out that episode of the podcast. But if you want to sort of explain a little bit more about how that is a misnomer and how that's not a real term.
Yeah, so the term living fossil, it has a variety of definitions. So it is not a really well-defined term. It's disagreed on exactly what it should apply to. But typically, it describes animals that either heavily resemble fossil animals or plants, organisms that heavily resemble their fossil relatives.
Right, like cycads, like coelacanths, things like that.
Or in the coelacanth situation, animals that were thought to be extinct and discovered not to be, or at least very reduced from what they once were. So they resemble the thing that they're related to in the fossil record, and they are one of the only things to do that. It's not like this big successful group has stayed successful. Yeah. They've dwindled to where now we have this one example.
And, like tuataras, which are rhynchocephalians, which used to be this big, popular, successful group, and now there is one or two, depending on who you ask, species in the entire world of that group that are relict of that ancient population.
And the issue with the term, the reason many scientists take issue with it, is one, it's not accurate. These animals are not the fossil animals. They look a lot alike, but that's not that is not the same animal, especially for cases like the coelacanth, where the fossil record is missing from now back to the dinosaurs. That's the coelacanth we have today is not the same that was with the dinosaurs. It's not even in the same overall group as the ones that would have been swimming around back then, but it looks a lot alike, so it gets clumped in.
Right. Living fossil makes it seem like the thing you have now is the same as the thing from 70 million years ago. Mm-hmm. And no, there's been 70 million years of change, even if that change has left the overall body shape still fairly similar.
Yes. And that's the big concern with this term as well, is that it gives the concept of stagnation, that these animals have gone unchanged since the time of whenever their last fossil was found. Right. And that it will often be kind of touted as an example of evolution in the slow lane, or evolution put on pause, or these animals outside of time, none of which are true.
And in fact, this is referenced directly in the Pokedex.
Yep.
So Pokemon fans out there will recognize Relicanth, which is a Pokemon based on the coelacanth, a real-life living fish.
Which is awesome.
Which is a great, cool Pokemon, cool fish. And Relicanth has a Pokedex entry that says it's been unchanged for 100 million years because it's the perfect life form.
Yes.
Which is exactly the misconception that living fossil carries with it, is this idea that here's an animal or plant or whatever that overcame the need to evolve or somehow stepped outside of natural selection, which is misleading for the very simple fact that that's just simply not how evolution works.
Yeah, it feeds that idea that evolution is working toward an ideal.
Yeah, that there is perfection.
Yeah, that if you gave a planet as much time and resources as you could, eventually you would get, Superman, and you would get, enter other anime.
Relicanth.
Yes. You would get the ultimate being. You get Shadow the Hedgehog.
Yes.
So that actually, since talking about evolution, that's pretty topical. So you also in that episode talk a lot about, it's not the majority of the episode, obviously, but you talk a bit about how evolution is also a bit of a misnomer in Pokemon. Yes. And at one point you referenced that sometimes and I actually checked, and it's not all that often that it happens, but sometimes when a Pokemon evolves, it just completely changes phyla for no reason.
Yeah, sure does.
So I know something that I've sort of looked into in the past was trying, not all that successfully, to come up with some kind of Pokemon phylogeny. Yeah. And for the most part, I had only been considering final evolutions, but that's not necessarily always how we do things in real phylogenetics. Like I'm in a paleobiology class right now, which is mostly focused on vertebrate and chordate things. and we were talking about some of the non-vertebrate chordates. And, if you look at things like cephalochordates, which are these, for non-biology people, they're these little tiny guys who basically just have a mouth and a notochord, and they just kind of swim around and don't do a whole lot other than that. They're just very small, almost eel-like things.
Yeah.
But they're not actually our closest non-chordate relatives. There's actually these other little things called urochordate, or I think the name has since been changed, but I learned it as urochordates. Sea squirts. They're basically just like a little bag of something that attaches to a rock. And if you were to only look at its adult form, that's what it looks like. But as a larva, it's actually much more like a cephalochordate.
Yeah, and it loses those chordate-like features as it grows.
Yeah, so I don't know. Have you put much thought into like some kind of Pokemon phylogeny or how that would even happen?
Well, yeah, I've seen a bunch of different people who have tried to do that. And we actually have known at least a couple people who have done that as an educational tool.
Yes.
Okay.
For younger kids to be like, hey, here's how we classify life. Do it with Pokemon. Find the characteristics, that awesome. They share, stuff like that. And I always sort of in my head, I've never tried to come up with a Pokemon phylogeny, but I generally do the same thing that you were describing, where I'll kind of group a family, an evolutionary family together.
Yes.
Right. Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard are the same lineage.
Right.
Which kind of works. It means that there's a whole lot of convergent evolution going on. Because you keep getting like fish show up multiple times and things like that as you jump different groups through evolution. But it's also complicated by the fact that the terminology in Pokemon differs from how we talk about it in the real world.
Yeah.
So evolution, obviously, and we talked about this as you referenced, what they call evolution in Pokemon is really metamorphosis.
Yes.
Right. You are a juvenile young form rapidly transforming into a completely different type of creature as your next life stage. But there is also natural selection in Pokemon, which is referenced in the Pokedex rather often, that things have ancestors and they've changed over time. But then also, each life stage of these Pokemon is called a species.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? Charmander and Charmeleon are considered different species by the Pokedex, which means that the Pokemon world also uses the word species differently than we do.
Yeah, they're treating each stage as its own animal.
Right. Which here in the real world, species are related by generational descent.
Yes.
A species can give rise to another species over generations, but a Charmeleon is the same organism as that Charmander.
Yeah, just like a caterpillar is the same organism as the butterfly.
Right. So we wouldn't consider those different species, but Pokemon World clearly designs them as different species with different behaviors and different backgrounds. Sometimes there's even, I can't think of an example, but I'm pretty sure there are Pokedex entries that will describe the histories of later stages of Pokemon that seem not necessarily consistent with histories described for the younger stages of Pokemon.
Okay.
And the game universe seems to treat them distinctly.
That they are actually becoming a new thing.
Right.
When they evolve.
Which makes it hard to come up with an evolutionary scenario. The one thing that I will say that I totally agree, that I stand by, is that I've seen some people try to do phylogeny and they'll use type as a character to link groups, which I disagree with. I think type is convergent.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually funny that you mentioned that, because I think at one point around about a year ago, so I was in a phylogenetic systematics class, here in grad school. And I think toward the end of that semester, I tried just taking a handful. I think I used maybe 10 Pokemon and then tried to code some characters for them. And I'm like, this is so hard, because like you're given so little information about them. You have to assume a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's never, explicitly confirmed that, like even things as basic as like Arcanine has a backbone.
Yeah.
Right.
Which things like very basic that like you just look at it and you're like, okay, it definitely does. But we've never been given an arcanine skeleton. So,
and making those assumptions is easy when you're looking at like Arcanine or Meowth, but then when it's like, all right, but the Sudowoodo and like Wobbuffet.
Is Sudowoodo made of wood?
Yeah.
Is it made of rock? Is it an animal somehow?
Is Wobbuffet invertebrate?
Right.
Is it gelatinous?
Remoraid should have bones, but Octillery,
yes,
we would expect not to have bones. Does it lose the bones?
Yep,
Is Octillery a bony octopus? What exactly can we infer here?
Yeah,
exactly. Let's see. So let's shift topics a little bit. So I don't think you actually mentioned this a ton in your episode about Pokemon, but there are also several non-fossil Pokemon that are heavily based or influenced by certain fossil animals. And the first one that comes to my mind is Torterra. Torterra is one of my absolute favorites. It was, Gen 4 was the first game that I actually spent a ton of time in.
nice.
And Turtwig was, my first starter in that.
Nice.
So what are some of your favorite paleo inspired Pokemon off the top of your head?
Ooh. The first one I always think of is Mamoswine.
Mamoswine's a big one.
Yeah.
Which is, despite being a pig, is clearly mammoth inspired. And that's a lot of fun. Relicanth we talked about.
Yeah.
Which is also one of those, technically not a fossil, but clearly based on a creature that has this famous fossil history.
My favorite of the new ones is Dragapolt.
Oh, right.
Which is based off of an ancient cousin of amphibians called Diplocalus, which had that boomerang-shaped head and the long, fin-like tail. And I think the Pokedex for that one, even because it's ghost type, but it says that they are ghosts from Pokemon that used to live in the ancient oceans in that area.
Which is such a cool idea that I'm astonished it took 20 years for Pokemon to come up with that, to give us ghost ancient Pokemon. Yep. That's so cool.
Yeah. And so that actually sort of leads into something that I want to talk about toward the end. Basically about how all the fossil Pokemon are rock type. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's see. So, and I know, David, I know that you are the only geologist of the two, but obviously I'd like both of your input. So I have been very frustrated with Pokemon in the last handful of generations for how little they actually incorporate any geological things. The Pokemon world is so, vast, and it's like biological information, but they really don't do much in terms of the geology. So the only things that I've really been able to actually look at and be like, oh, they actually put some thought into that was Vast Pony Canyon in Alola, which is really cool. Like, that's one of my favorite locations in any of the games, because you can very clearly see, all of the really nice stratigraphy and even some structure. There's lots of tilted beds all through there. But I just want to get your thoughts on some of the geology that there is or isn't in Pokemon.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's a lot of superficial, like there's volcanoes everywhere, the geology, but then they don't go much past that. One thing that I've often found myself thinking about is wondering whether the fossils in any particular region are from the same strata.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in 3rd Gen, you get Anorith and Lileep.
Yep.
And Crinoids and what is Anomalocaris, which you, depending on what ages, I don't think they give an age for Lileep specifically, if I remember correctly.
I don't believe so.
And Anorith is said to be 300 million years old. You've got Ammonite and Kabuto. Ammonite, through inference, is 100 million years old. I think there's a Turtoga or Caracosta entry that says 100 million and then says they eat Amistar. I think that's how I got Ammonite at 100. And Kabuto is said to go back to 300 million, but then another entry says that they're still alive today, so I guess they could technically be from the same strata.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm always kind of looking for. I don't know if they're actively thinking about it, but that thought of, if you find two fossil Pokemon in the same region, is this the one fossil-bearing stratum? Did these fossil creatures actually interact with each other?
Yeah.
Right.
And could you find Kabuto in, the Hoenn region?
Yeah. Are you getting them from the same deposit or just from the same general area,
right,
but multiple ages?
And I like to think about how, in the Kanto region, you get your fossils in Mount Moon.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably that there is this geological feature being preserved within the sedimentary structures of the mountain. And then I always like to think about, if they tell us where the fossil came from, I like to think about what that says about the geology of this region. All right, Mount Moon is made partially of limestone or shale, I guess. That's kind of cool to know.
Yeah.
It's not overt, but you have to take a couple of steps past the text to get that.
And then with that, I like to think about, I've tried to really piece together a little bit of like paleo environments, especially with where you get the fossils in Generation 8. Because, we can talk forever about how weird and goofy the Generation 8 fossils are.
We sure could.
But trying to think of just what kind of environment would yield a Dunkleosteus-based fossil with a dino and some kind of dinosaur. Well, two types of dinosaurs with the bird as well. But that's something I've tried to think a lot about, and I'm like, the only thing that I could think of is that there's just different strata with some kind of unconformity between them.
Yeah.
Although a fun thing that I actually did come across when I made a video about Dracovish was that that's actually kind of a mistranslation, calling it I'm sorry, not Dracovish, like Archivish, the dino fossil, is that in Japanese it's actually called the fossil plesiosaur.
Yeah, it is. So the Japanese name knew what they were talking about.
Yep.
Kind of.
And I think it might have been too many characters for English. I think that's why that might have happened. But who knows with Game Freak. Let's see. So
it's an interesting question, because of those, if you take each of those four creatures as what they are most resembling, Dunkleosteus, a plesiosaur, a dromaeosaur of some kind, and a stegosaur of some kind.
Yep.
None of those should be in the same place at the same time.
No.
So this guy is the what are they? The digging duo. Yep. Is that what their name is?
Yep.
They must be traveling all over the wild area, getting these things.
Yeah. And so that was something
washed into a spot.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Or they're fabricating them.
Yeah.
They're in league with Perilous the scientists, just making stuff up. Like you said, we could talk all day about the Galar Pokemon.
And that kind of goes back a little bit to the geology, in that, like, granted, I know a lot of people have complained a lot about the graphics in the wild area. At this point, who cares? But I wish that they had given any kind of, even just difference from spot to spot in the wild area, because there's lots of rocks,
Yeah.
The only place that has any even marginally different geology is the Dusty Bowl area, but that's only because it's like a desert type area.
Right.
I've always kind of wondered that with rock type Pokemon. Like I don't know I can't ID rocks by sight, but it has always stood out to me that they don't seem to make much effort to be like, let's base this rock type on this kind of rock. Right. Like let's make a granite, Pokemon, or it's just rocks, of various colors. And I thought that would be a neat way for them to work some of that in, is take characteristics of rocks and work them into the persona and description of the Pokemon.
That would also be a fun way to do regional variants. To say in the Alola region, Geodude is made of limestone, and then in the Kanto region it's made of granite or something, reflecting the geology. Something like that could be cool.
Yeah. Or even, because the first one that comes to mind when you say that is Crustle. And Crustle very clearly has, strata in its shell. And, if you, a Crustle in the Alola region, you might think, it's a bunch of volcanic islands. It might make it out of like a basalt instead of a sandstone, which I think would be a really cool way to do regional variants, like you said, which actually also leads into my next question.
Go for it.
That has been one of the best things that Pokemon's ever done, in my opinion, regional variants.
Yes.
Big fan.
And but something that I've kind of thought a lot about and only came up with one decent answer is why, for example, like Linoon in the Galar region can evolve, but Linoon from other places can't. So I was wondering some of your thoughts, maybe on why that might be.
I have an immediate thought. Go for it.
I was going to say, my first thought is Grizzlies versus Kodiak Bears.
Interesting.
So for anyone out there who doesn't know, Grizzlies and Kodiaks, which are the West Coast big bears here in North America,
big brown bear,
are just brown bears. Yep. They're the same kind of brown bear. They are regional subgroups, though, because of certain features in their diet and their size. Kodiak bears, on average, are much larger than like the California grizzly bear, and a lot of people have pointed to that. They get a huge boon from the salmon run that makes its way through there up north, and that's just nothing but protein and fat. So they have gotten huge, but it's the same type of brown bear. Just in this area, they get bigger on average because things are better for them up there.
On a very similar note, my first thought went back to the metamorphosis question. There are a lot of species who metamorphose, right? Salamanders and insects, where in certain environmental conditions, they won't metamorphose into their adult stage.
Yeah.
So there are salamanders, for example, who under certain conditions will basically retain their aquatic juvenile stage and just be an adult that way and never grow up. I think, what are they, the trilobite beetles?
Yes.
I feel like I don't know how to describe a trilobite beetle. It's awesome. Google trilobite beetle. They look so cool. But I think the famous trilobite beetle is what we call neotenic, meaning that it never actually attains an adult stage. It just kind of holds on to its larval stage.
Interesting. And
that kind of is what it makes me think of, that maybe in the Galar region, the environmental conditions are just right that Galarian Linoon takes that next step, whereas everywhere else, Linoon has basically, if we're talking evolutionarily, lost that trait of taking on an adult form and just sort of becomes final in its earlier stage.
Okay.
There could also be, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I said there could also be an argument made that the average Poke scientist in the Pokemon world is a lumper, not a splitter.
That's true.
In that they are looking at these regional variants and saying, well, no, that's obviously still Meowth. While maybe a scientist from our world would come in and go, no, that's at least a subspecies. Like,
right.
Come on, that's not Meowth. That's something different.
That's a good point.
Like maybe they don't discern Pokemon by genetics much.
But yeah, because I remember when Galarian Linoon and Obstagoon were first announced before the games even came out. This was something that I thought about, and so I'd never actually heard the term that used. What was that term again? Where they just retain it?
Right. Neoteny. Now you will hear neoteny and you will hear paedomorphosis.
Okay, that's the term that I've heard.
And I've heard them used, depending on who you ask, it differs how they're used, but they can. I've heard them used either for the evolutionary process where adults retain juvenile features. So humans are an example of that, right? Adult humans are similar to the young of other apes because through our evolution, juvenile features like giant craniums persisted through age, right? We kept it older and older, but also, and also you'll hear it referred to a salamander, for example, that is aquatic as a larva and then becomes terrestrial as an adult, attaining sexual maturity without ever actually becoming terrestrial is called neotenic.
Okay.
Among people who discern, I have heard pedomorphosis used for the evolutionary long-term idea and neoteny used for the sort of individual, this is an individual that never actually...
Developmental scale.
But I also know people who say that they're sort of interchangeable.
Okay. But yeah, because like I said, I made a video about Linoon actually when they were revealed, and that was basically what I went to, is like, oh, it's basically just an axolotl, you know?
Right.
In other regions, but in Galar, for some reason, the environment is okay enough that instead of staying in that pond or stream its whole life, it comes out onto the water, or out of the water.
Right.
So, it was really cool to get different perspectives on that as well.
Well, and the thing I like is they've introduced such variety now that there could be multiple causes for multiple of the regional forms.
Yeah.
Like maybe Linoon evolves for a different reason than Farfetch'd does into a form we haven't been used to seeing.
Right. It's not just the climate. It's several different factors affecting different Pokemon.
And so, yeah, one could be doing it for a very different reason than another.
Yeah.
You know, maybe Farfetch'd is doing it in response to predators that aren't.
That would be my first guess.
Yep. Yeah. I need a sword and a shield here.
You became a fighting type because there's a lot to fight. Because Obstagoon's around. And you gotta fight
yes.
And then so that actually is really interesting in thinking about Meowth and how Meowth has two different regional variants. And I think that in the Alolan form, it was actually selectively bred that way. I want to say that was in the Pokedex.
You might be right. I don't remember specifically.
I know somebody in the comments will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong.
I know that it says that Meowth and Persian in the Alolan region are selectively bred because they look the way they do. Like that they are selectively bred because, you know, for their velvet fur or something like that.
Right.
I don't remember if it says that they were selectively bred into the regional variant. You could be right. I don't remember.
But that also is really interesting. And you guys have a whole episode about island evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and it makes the most sense that, you know, with Galar and Alola having regional variants, that they're both island, you know, island regions. So hopefully they keep continuing this, and, you know, maybe, you know, 20 years from now when they redo the redo of, you know, like Hoenn or something, you know, because that's also an island region. They'll add some, you know, Hoenn forms of something else.
That'd be awesome. Meowth, I also immediately and just brought to mind that domestic species, you know, cats are one of the most successful animals on the planet because we've lugged them everywhere. So it makes sense if Meowth is akin, or at least, you know, close to a domestic cat, that, you know, everywhere you go, you're going to see a slightly different Meowth, because here we wanted them to be shaggy, and here we wanted them to be this way and that way.
There are a few Pokemon in the Alolan Pokedex that are said to be invasive, that they were introduced. I think Rattata might be one of those that they were brought over, and now they have sort of spread everywhere because people introduced them.
Yeah. So let's see. So I guess I'll wrap up, because I want your thoughts on, like I mentioned, the fossil Pokemon being rock types.
Right.
So I don't remember at all when I got this idea. But at some point in the past, you know, way before I even had this channel, I got in my mind that somehow, like, that the fossil Pokemon were not originally rock type. Because some of them, I'm like, okay, what reason does this have to be rock type other than that it is a fossil?
Yes.
So then I kind of thought, especially like after I went through, you know, some of my like geology classes, I was like, okay, maybe that's like added diagenetically, which for the non-geologic folks basically means alteration of something. It doesn't have to be a fossil, but alteration of something after it's been deposited and has become rock. So a really common thing is for fossils, you know, I was doing some field work this summer in the Peel Shale in South Dakota. And in the member that we were in, all of the fossils were just completely destroyed by gypsum. So like water will flow through the rocks, and the water has different dissolved things in it, and those dissolved things can replace the fossils and make them more or less stable, depending on, usually less stable. But so I want to get some of your thoughts on that, maybe, because I've had some people in the comments also say, you know, maybe these are the only ones that we see, because you would think with the amount of strata that we have that there would be more than the 20, close to 30 or so fossil Pokemon that we have, that only the rock types get preserved.
Right.
And that was something that I
That's
hadn't thought about.
I will say, so I've been playing Pokemon since for as long as there have been Pokemon, and the explanation you said was what I always thought too.
Yeah.
Is that they are rock type because they were fossil. That at some point along the way, becoming fossilized granted them the characteristics of rock type.
Or that some aspect of the defossilization process pulls the fact that they've been mineralized into it. That's the way I always interpreted it.
That it's the Jurassic Park, Jurassic World explanation of what you're reconstructing isn't actually what you originally had.
That's the way I always interpreted it, is that the machine is not perfect. And it's going, well, we've got like 90% of the animal here, so we're
filling the rest with rocks.
But the machine can't tell a difference between rock and rock type when it's trying to recreate and implants that onto the Pokemon.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That actually really cool. Fits with, in recent generations, the Pokemon, there have been a handful of Pokedex entries that have actually taken that stance of what we're reconstructing isn't necessarily what the original one was. Tyrantrum has an entry that says something like that, straight out of the Jurassic World handbook.
Yep.
And then Mega Aerodactyl.
Yes, that was a big part of what solidified that in my mind.
Yeah, Mega Aerodactyl has an entry that says that this is thought to be the true form of Aerodactyl. Although, to be fair, it gets more rocky.
It does.
In its supposed true form. I had never thought of the idea of preservation bias.
Yeah, which I really like.
Until I watched part of your video on it. And that's a cool idea that being rock type makes you more likely to preserve in the same way that being a trilobite makes you more likely to preserve than a worm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. I would, if I were being argumentative, which why not? I would then question why we don't see more steel types.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be my next question as well. But steel, you would imagine,
rust
would be. Oh yeah, I guess. Well, it's preserved in water and it gets all rusty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then of course the Galar Pokemon, the Galar fossil Pokemon, kind of throw a slight wrench in that, being the first fossil Pokemon. Although, you know what, the other thing actually that I've always thought, and I just remembered this and I should mention it. Rock, in addition to being the type, so I've spent a ton of time thinking about what makes the types.
Yeah.
Right, like some of them are easy, like what makes fire type, that's pretty straightforward, but like what makes a dark type Pokemon something, or what makes what makes you fairy type?
What are the trends among those?
And one of the trends in rock type, in addition to being physically made of rock much of the time, is ancientness.
Yes.
Yeah.
So like Relicanth. Relicanth is water and rock, and the only real reason why it should be rock is that it is this ancient,
been around a long time,
creature from the past. The fossil Pokemon are rock types. There are a number of Pokemon that are described as being older, having ties to ancient times. Ancient Power is a rock type move.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's this trend in just something about being old and historical.
Yeah.
Is part of that nebulous quality that makes you rock type, which might answer my question of why you don't get steel types, because maybe steel is more of a
that's often associated with modern stuff. Exactly.
Yeah, rock is ancient.
Yeah.
It's more than I think any other type. It has this association with the past and history and historical stuff.
Yeah,
I like all of these.
They're all good. Yeah, each generation, the answer is different.
And I like to think that I think that humans have a little bit of a bias toward like rocks being super, super old, because that was some of the first things that we really made stuff with.
Yeah.
Whereas there's also, some of the older Pokemon, not in geologic terms, but in sort of human timescales,
yes,
are more ground type, which is just non-consolidated rock. So like Claydol and Baltoy are said to be super old, but they were, associated with people.
Yeah.
Right.
Mamoswine, is, I'm sure it's only ground type because swine and Piloswine were.
Yeah.
But, it's old, but Ice Age old, so not terribly old. But I also like that you point out in your Pokemon paleontology episode that they actually sort of thought a little bit about the geologic timescale when talking about the fossil Pokemon anyway. And that it actually more or less, some things are sort of inconsistent, such as Anorith, Anomalocaris is actually much older than 300 million years. But other than that, things line up more or less okay.
Yeah, they do a fairly decent job.
But so I wish that they would pay that much attention to the actual how we know that,
Yes.
That would be something that I really want to happen in Gen 9.
Well, that's something that if I were to sort of make a wish about how they would discuss the fossil Pokemon a little more, and I think that it would resolve a lot of my concerns about the Galar fossil Pokemon, is if they put a little bit more into where they come from, how we got them, how we learn what we've learned about them, because I think that there's a difference between incorporating fossils into your thing and incorporating paleontology.
Yes.
Right. It's the difference between, say, Jurassic Park and The Land Before Time.
Yeah.
Right. They're both movies with dinosaurs, but only one of them has paleontologists who we see doing research and talking about discoveries and comparing what they're learning now to what they learned before. Right. That's paleontology in action. And that's something that is really, every now and then you'll get a Pokedex entry that kind of talks a little bit about a discovery of something, or here's the theory about something. But the only thing we've really ever gotten of, here's the sort of coming to recognize this Pokemon process, is the Galar example, which is a bad example, which is the tropey bad paleontologist in TV kind of example.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a shame. I wish that they would bring in more of that kind of discovery aspect of it.
Well, I'd love to see more of what they did with Dragapult's entry. Even if you just threw in little things to be like, oh, you can find fossils over there. The scientists say that used to be an ancient sea, some millions of years ago, or the types of rock we're finding here show us that this was a desert one time, even though it's a forest now. Like, whatever it is, something like that would be cool, just because that gives some context, it gives some explanation. And like, I know as a kid I would have loved that, because then now I can picture where those fossil Pokemon were living.
Right.
Because that's something they don't do very often, is like, here's Tyrantrum. All right, but like, what was Tyrantrum living in when it was here? Like, why is it here? Stuff like that would be really cool. And that wouldn't take much. It wouldn't distract.
One of my favorite things in the history of Pokemon is, I believe the first time that I saw this was in the Slateport Museum, where there's a bunch of exhibits about boating and shipping in the ocean. And you go around and you click, and there's like a little paragraph that is actually cool, interesting scientific or engineering information. And it's like, here in the middle of your Pokemon game, here's like a sentence about how boats are built. That's awesome. Like, someone was tasked, right? Someone's job was, hey, fill in this museum. And they like went and read a book and then came back and like put in a bunch of little tidbits. And that's really cool.
I want to say there was a little bit of that as well in the space station in Moss Deep.
Yes, you're right.
And I don't know if that was there in the original games or if it was just in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. I don't quite remember. But either way, and like you said, that doesn't take all that much. That takes just a random NPC somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's all I've kind of got for you guys. Do you guys have any questions or things that you want to know from me? Or
well, this is not at all on this subject.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
What are you working on?
Yeah.
So, I like to phrase it as that I study time. So,
okay. That narrows it down.
Yeah.
I'm sure your thesis advisor is thrilled about that.
I'm picturing your office just like the cartoon things are just covered in clocks.
Like from Back to the Future.
Yes.
Right.
So I do biochronology.
Okay.
So there's a local fauna site here in South Dakota from like the mid-Miocene. And basically, it was this gravel quarry back in like the late 50s. And so they noticed all these bones just falling out of the gravel as they were quarrying it. And so they called the director of the museum here at the School of Mines at the time. And, he came out and they had to collect it because obviously, this quarry company's not going to stop their operation, just let these pesky scientists get in there.
Yep, we know how that works.
Yep.
So they had to literally rake it off the conveyor belt as the gravel was on its way to the crusher.
Yep.
So there is so much collection bias in my collection.
Wow.
But I mean, it was a channel lag deposit anyway, so it was all very disarticulated to begin with. But anyway, so I am updating a lot of the taxonomy, and it's, as you probably know, it's from the mid-Miocene. Lots of horses.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of horses, some camels. But I'm updating all the taxonomy because nothing's really been done on it since the early 80s. And then figuring out when exactly it was in the Miocene, comparing it to different sites of known time.
Okay,
Cool.
Very interesting. That's cool. We are always, most of my interest and research has not been in a particular time period, really.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my favorite stuff in my bias is older stuff. Cretaceous is good stuff. But Miocene always makes my ears perk up.
Yes.
Because we work at the Gray Fossil Site.
Yeah.
And that is latest Miocene, early Pliocene, depending on which of our researchers you ask. And so I'm always intrigued to hear what's going on in other sites like that. And South Dakota, the first field work I ever did was in South Dakota.
Oh, okay.
Out in the Black Hills. So South Dakota also has a little, my ears perk up when I hear South Dakota.
Double whammy.
Yep.
Yep, and I actually got to teach our SEDSTRAT lab last year, so we got to spend lots of time just exploring the hills, and we got to go to the Great Unconformity, where there's a billion years of missing time, which is so cool.
Yep, excellent.
But so with that, I want to thank you guys, for coming on, taking your time. Definitely make sure to check out the Common Descent podcast, wherever you can find your podcasts. As we've talked about, a lot of really great paleontological, and the news, I think, has, as much as I enjoy the actual topic of each video, the news, I think, is also a part that I really enjoy, just because, I'm so busy doing my own research that I don't have a ton of time to, keep up with what everyone else in the paleo world has been doing. So they start off every episode with a couple paleo news stories, which has been super helpful to me.
That's actually a big part of why we started the podcast. Is
keep ourselves up to date with information.
Yeah, because we both graduated and then went into education, not research. And that's a little while afterward, both had a conversation of like, hey, I feel a lot of my information just slipping away and I don't feel up to date anymore. And so having the news section was as much for us as the listeners to keep us up to date and force us to do some homework.
That's really funny. That's also a little bit why I do some of the more bio-heavy things on this channel, is because, when you're dealing purely with fossils, you don't do too much, organismal biology. A lot of the stuff that I was trained in, to know in my biological training, now it's mostly just anatomy.
Yep.
A little bit of ecology, as well. But that's a lot of why I do some of the more bio-heavy videos on the channel. But yeah, thank you guys for coming on. Make sure to check, I'll link all of your socials and things down in the description below as well. Make sure to check them out. Make sure to follow me on Twitter as well at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. And as always, there's a time and place for everything.